Commemorating World Environment Day on Now is brought to you by the Ministry of Planning and Development and the United Nations Development Programme.
All right, welcome back everybody, and good morning to those of you who have just joined us. As we said, on the 5th of June is World Environment Day, and we'll be celebrating, well, commemorating all day and giving you all the nuggets of information and facts that you need to know how you can do your part, the role that we human beings are taking with regard to the various things along the lines of the environment. And our first topic would be climate change. Now, that is a topic that we've been hearing on the television, on the radio, locally and internationally for so long. And joining us this morning to chat about that, it is Kishan Kumar Singh, who is the head of multilateral of the Environmental Agreements Unit. We also have Cindy Singh, who is a climate change specialist. Good morning to my guests and welcome.
Good morning, and thank you for having us.
Thank you for being with us today. And well, the Ministry of Planning and Development will be with us all morning this morning. So we're looking forward to all the conversations surrounding the environment. So first question, I'll ask you, Mr. Kumar Singh, why should we be concerned about climate change, and what is the government doing about climate change?
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning to your viewers. Climate change is a phenomenon that has come about largely as a result of man's activities. It's not a new thing. It's quite actually a very natural thing. The climate has changed many, many times over the past millennia, but it has done so at a rate at which natural systems have been able to adapt to that change. It has been done very slowly. What we talk about now in terms of climate change and why it's a concern is because it is thought to be human-induced, and that as a result of primarily the emitting of what is called greenhouse gases into the atmosphere,
Right.
Largely carbon dioxide, and coming from man's activities, primarily the combustion of fossil fuels for energy use. These greenhouse gases cause a warming of the atmosphere, and when the atmosphere warms, of course, the ambient temperature goes up, and increased heat content of the atmosphere is dissipated in the climate system, and therefore we call global warming and climate change as two separate terms used interchangeably, but meaning largely the same terms. You have global warming, but you also have climate change as the manifestation of that warming. And that those changes in the climate are happening now at an accelerated rate, according to the science. The science is very clear, and it's happening at a rate at which it is projected that natural systems and human systems, because you often forget that the human beings are part of the ecosystem, it's happening at an accelerated rate at which these systems are not able or will not be able to cope or adapt to these changes, and therefore it's likely that we can reach a tipping point where we can have catastrophic changes in the climate, and therefore the projected changes and impacts might not necessarily be predictable or able to be projected through climate models. And this is very worrying, particularly for small island developing states such as Trinidad and Tobago. Some of the impacts manifest themselves, of course, as ambient temperature increases in the atmosphere and the climate system, but we have also projected to see in this part of the region, in Trinidad and Tobago, changes in sea level rise, for example, as a result of the thermal expansion of seawater,
Right.
And as well the melting of glaciers in the northern and the southern poles, and those mainland glaciers as well. As a result of the temperature increases, we are expected to see changes in precipitation. So we are projected to see less rainfall over the long-term period, and we are already seeing evidence of that from the meteorological data, but also increased intensity. So if you have increased temperatures, you have increased evaporation, and what goes up must come down.
Must come down, right.
Exactly, and if more goes up, more will come down. And therefore the intensity of rainfall is expected to increase. We are also already seeing that from the meteorological records. You would recall some years ago, we had floods in the middle of a meteorological drought. And that irony is really a manifestation in itself of some of the changes in the climate that we expected to see. Changes in aridity of the soil, for example, as a result of climate change, can also lead to changes in food production and agricultural food security. This is not also only true for production systems in the country, but remember we have a large food import bill, and climate change impacts on those countries on which we depend on food are likely to have transboundary impacts to this country, because if it affects the food supply in the countries from which we import, it obviously will affect our accessibility and affordability.
Yeah. And therefore food security on a whole as well.
Exactly. So so when you put all of these things together, you have significant impacts on small island states. In fact, small island states face an existential threat from climate change when you put all of these impacts together, because some of the impacts are mutually enforcing, and you have what I call positive feedback loops, so that increasing temperature, for example, you have decreasing rainfall, you have increased demand for food production, and all of these mixed together in very complex ways, and therefore planning for climate change and adapting to climate change and reducing the impacts are critical aspects of the approach that has been taken both internationally and nationally. Internationally, the global community has signed on to the Paris Agreement, which aims to reduce or to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, because that is what the scientists say can be a manageable level for human systems and ecological systems to function optimally and provide the ecosystem services that they can, so that every government now is taking action to contribute to the achievement of the goals of the Paris Agreement. Trinidad and Tobago is no exception to that.
Well, I actually want to bring Cindy in the conversation, because I'm going to ask Cindy what actions are being undertaken by Trinidad and Tobago to meet the goals set out under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, as you mentioned earlier as well, Mr. Kumar Singh.
Thank you very much for the question. As Mr. Kumar Singh noted, the country has been doing quite a lot, and the effects are already being felt. We ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1994 and the Paris Agreement in 2018. And implementing these agreements is of particular importance to us because of all the impacts that we've just discussed. We actually have a national climate change policy, which was laid in Parliament in 2011. And this policy sets the enabling framework for the country to address climate change, both from the mitigation of greenhouse gases perspective, but also adapting to the impacts of climate change, including enhancing food security. As a ratified party to the Paris Agreement, we have submitted what is called the nationally determined contribution of Trinidad and Tobago, which sets a target for the country to reduce emissions by 15% by 2030 in the three main emitting sectors. Those are power generation, industry, and transportation. We also have an unconditional target to reduce by 30% in the public transportation sector. And to achieve all of these goals set in the NDC, the country has undertaken a number of things, which I probably won't have time to discuss all this morning. So I will just give you some examples of the things we are doing. An implementation plan for the NDC has been developed, and a ministerial steering committee has been established to oversee the implementation of these activities. For example, we have completed vulnerability and risk assessments for all the sectors in climate change. And these assessments will give you details of all the impacts discussed just now by Mr. Kumar Singh. And this is available online on the Ministry of Planning's website. We have also developed an updated greenhouse gas inventory for the period 2006 to 2018, which outlines where all our emissions are coming from. And congruent with this, we have a mitigation plan. So we know where our emissions are coming from, and therefore we can plan for where reductions can take place. The government is partnering with a number of its lead agencies, well, not partnering, but spearheading a number of initiatives through its ministries, such as Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, and Ministry of Public Utilities, to develop a utility-scale renewable energy project to add approximately 112 megawatts of solar power to the grid. And the negotiations for this project are already underway. We are also partnering with the European Union and UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program, to install renewable energy at various public and community entities to support the renewable energy pilot installations nationally, and also to support renewable energy policy framework for enabling renewable energy to become a source of power for us here in Trinidad and Tobago. There's also a component of that project which seeks to install a solar farm at the Piarco International Airport. We are also in the process of developing a policy for e-mobility, which will facilitate a transition towards the use of electric vehicles. As you're aware, CNG is a transitionary fuel, and the country must take steps to move towards the use of electric vehicles. You would be interested to know that the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards has already developed a standard for electric vehicle charging ports. And that is one part of the work being done. The Ministry of Planning is seeking to understand the cost of infrastructure to support this transition. Recently, you would have heard from the Minister of Planning and Development on our exploration of the feasibility of carbon markets to leverage climate finance to under the Paris Agreement, which has provisions for market mechanisms, which are currently being negotiated actually, and we are, Mr. Kumar Singh and I are currently in session under UNFCCC to finalize the rulebook for the Paris Agreement. Another thing that I would like to mention would be the development of a monitoring, reporting, and verification system that has been developed by the Ministry of Planning and being operated by the Environmental Management Authority. And this system is seeking to facilitate the collection, analysis, and transparent reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and efforts to mitigate them. We are also seeking now to develop a pilot project to conduct certification of persons who would have to do such reporting using the system. We also had a pilot project in late 2019 to early 2020, where volunteer stakeholders across the public and private sector voluntarily submitted their emissions data. So we were able to test the system and iron out some of the kinks in the system. So I'll stop there because it's quite a lot, and maybe you have questions. Yeah.
Now, I've been hearing in news reports for some time, and Kishan mentioned it earlier about 1.5 degrees. That is pretty much the high bar of which we can allow the Earth to warm via global warming and the greenhouse gases and whatnot. Unfortunately, Trinidad has been classed as the per capita, the highest in the world when it comes to our carbon footprint per capita. What can we do as individuals to try to decrease our carbon footprint and therefore decrease the effect that we have on the environment with our daily practices?
I think that's a very good question, because ultimately the victim of climate change is the individual, and therefore the responsibility to mitigate and to adapt is the individual. So largely responsibility lies with the individual. As we already have an unflattering metric that being of high per capita emissions, but that is as a result of our vibrant oil and gas and petrochemical industry, coupled with a very low population, a relatively low population. So that's not unexpected. Nonetheless, it remains a valid metric that that has to be addressed. But at the individual level, I think once the first thing, of course, that needs to be addressed is knowledge, public awareness, and education, so that the individual is aware of his own actions and how it impacts on the environment. We usually have this laissez-faire, nonchalant approach that, well, my actions wouldn't make a difference.
Right.
Collectively, when you put it together, the per capita metric is a classic example. It gives you an idea of how collective action actually contributes. So individually, what we can do is look at our own practices. For example, our energy consumption practices at home, turning off lights, turning off air conditioning units to facilitate conservation of electricity.
Right.
Looking at how we use transportation, carpooling, looking at public transport. Admittedly, the public transport infrastructure does not necessarily lend itself to that kind of efficiency. But I know that efforts are being made to increase that. But it also requires a culture shift because the average Canadian wants his own car. When you look at the car population, when you look at the population of the country, it's almost 1-to-1.
Yeah, that's right.
Everyone wants their own car. As soon as you reach driving age,
they want to. Mr. Kumar Singh, we're going to have to stick a pin in it there. I want to thank you both for joining us this morning and giving us this information on climate change and how we can do our part to mitigate it, and what the government is doing as well by the Ministry of Planning and other ministries that you are spearheading toward that goal and that end. So I want to thank you, Kishan Kumar Singh, Head of Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit. I want to thank you as well, Cindy Singh, Climate Change Specialist, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Coming up, thank you so much. Coming up next, we're going to be speaking about land degradation, but for now, we're going to take a short break and come back with much more.
Commemorating World Environment Day on Now is brought to you by the Ministry of Planning and Development and the United Nations Development Programme.